front of house manager here at the Woody Guthrie Center. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. We're so proud to be a host to the American Folklore Society weekend. You folks pack it on in, I'll tell you that. Yes, yes. Yeah, give it up for yourselves. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you guys letting us collect your zip codes. It does help us with our grant money, so I appreciate you folks being patient with my staff and letting us capture those. It's very essential for us. I appreciate that. As always, we're going to start with our land acknowledgement, folks. We acknowledge that the land on which we're gathered is the home of the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, and Osage nations, as well as the ancestral tribes of the Caddo and numerous other tribes who call this land their home before their forced removal. We respect their hospitality and honor their history. We further recognize that 101 years ago, this very neighborhood was destroyed by the violence of bigotry and racial hatred. As we recognize the atrocities of the past, we cannot forget that the fight for equality is far from over. The Woody Guthrie Center is dedicated to spreading Woody's message of diversity, equality, and justice. We educate visitors, teachers, students, and scholars about Woody's life, legacy, relevance, and his important role in American history. It is our honor to share this positive message with the new generation who can create their own ripples of change. Folks, we welcome you here to the Woody Guthrie Center. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As I was saying, I'm Sam Flowers, your front of house manager here. We do have your dual tickets available for you for entrance into the Woody Guthrie Center and the Bob Dylan Center. We'll be offering them at a discount for you. Please take advantage of them. 10 to 6 are our hours. We have with us here today our program, This Land is Whose Land? And we have Professor Dan Swan, who's going to start us on off. I'm going to go ahead and let the professor go ahead and start.
Thank you so much. Well, we certainly appreciate all the efforts of the staff of the Woody Guthrie Center to facilitate the program and to welcome us with open arms. So good morning, my name is Dan Swan, and I'd like to welcome you to the This Land is Whose Land program, hosted by the American Song Archives, Woody Guthrie Center, and Bob Dylan Center, and the American Folklore Society. I want to thank the American Folklore Society Cultural Diversity Committee and the American Folklore Society Local Arrangements Committee for their support and contributions to this effort. Without their hard work and encouragement, we wouldn't be sitting here this morning. I'd also like to extend a sincere appreciation to the Arvest Foundation for their financial support of our program this morning. This program stems from the efforts and the desire of the Local Arrangements Committee of the American Folklore Society to facilitate a number of forward-facing programs during their annual meeting here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They took on this additional challenge. It's a daunting task to host an international conference. But they had a very, very strong desire to bring some of the topics and themes of folklore studies into a broader community setting for discussion and reflection. So I applaud their efforts, and I think that academic and professional organizations will be well served to follow their example. I also want to recognize the incredible contributions of my co-chair in organizing and facilitating this, Chloe Fort. Chloe is the program and event manager for the Archive of American Song, Woody Guthrie Center, Bob Dylan Center, and she invested a tremendous amount of effort to get us here this morning, get things arranged. We're live streaming, we have overflow capacity, so Chloe and her folks did an incredible job to get us organized and here together this morning. So we have a very distinguished panel with us this morning who are going to share some of their experiences and perspectives. Their respective accomplishments exceed my ability to adequately recognize them this morning, but they all include exceptional levels of community service and public education. Too many notes. Vicki Monks, I'll go from my left, move more than 30 years as a writer, reporter, photographer, radio and TV producer. Her broadcast work has appeared on National Public Radio, BBC Radio, CBS 60 Minutes, National Geographic Television, and PBS, with articles published in National Wildlife Magazine, Rolling Stone Magazine, Vogue, and the American Journalism Review. Her articles and documentaries have tackled global environmental issues from the deforestation of Irian Jaya in Indonesia to the contamination of our oceans with plastic trash and the worldwide problems with endocrine disrupting chemicals. She has a long list of national and international awards, including a 2005 Society for Environmental Journalism Award for radio for a story about industrial contamination on Indian lands. A citizen of Chickasaw Nation, she's currently living in Oklahoma, where she's working on a book about contemporary Indian communities and the environmental threats to Indian land. So her left is Jo K. Dowell, is a Quapaw, Cherokee, Eastern Shawnee mother, grandmother, elder, activist, and community organizer who lives on Cherokee reservation lands near Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Jo K. received her BA in Mass Communications, Media Studies from Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, and her impressive career as a journalist includes articles published in Indian Country Today, Native American Times, Native Oklahoma Magazine, the Cherokee Phoenix, and Indigenous Women's Magazine. Among her many projects as a community organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network, Jo K. coordinated a COVID intervention program that delivered more than 250,000 protective masks and PPE to culturally traditional Indigenous communities, frontline healthcare organizations throughout Indian country from the Arctic Circle to federal indigenous reserves in Brazil. In 2017, Jo K. received the Will Ankew Humanitarian Award at the Dream Keepers event sponsored by the Greater Tulsa Area Indian Affairs Commission and the City of Tulsa Human Rights Department. And to her left is Dr. Charlotte Wilson Heth, a professor emerita from UCLA, where she taught courses in music, ethnomusicology, and American Indian Studies for 20 years. During her career at UCLA, she also served as director of the American Indian Studies Center, chair of the ethnomusicology department, and associate dean for the School of Arts and Architecture. Professor Heth has also worked at Cornell University as director of the American Indian program and a visiting professor of music. After retiring, she worked at the National Museum of the American Indian for 5 years as assistant director for public programs. She continues an active research and publication program, doing applied work in and publishing on American Indian music, ethnomusicology, dance, education, and other topics. She's a past president of the Society for Ethnomusicology and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. It's also my great pleasure to share the news that Dr. Heth was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Folklore Society at their opening ceremony last night. In 1940, Woody Guthrie first penned the words for what would become his most venerated song, "This Land Is Your Land." Nearly a century after it was written, the song remains active in the collective consciousness of America, equally praised as it is debated. Through Guthrie, a white male folk hero, remained committed to excavating the plight of America's most vulnerable, the question remains, just who is this song speaking to? Whose land is this land? To further explore this question, the American Song Archives, Woody Guthrie Center, and Bob Dylan Center, in collaboration with the American Folklore Society, developed this program to facilitate continued discussion of This Land Is Whose Land. Using Guthrie's lyrics as a starting point, we hope to facilitate an examination of topics relating to land, sovereignty, and environmental justice in indigenous communities. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to get us started here with some opening statements and opening comment, drawing upon their experiences, their work with issues that relate to our topic at hand today, and to frame our ongoing conversation. So,
I can start.
Charlotte?
Okay. I'm a substitute for Ben Barnes, who had a family and tribal emergency, so I haven't prepared very well what I'm going to say. So I'm going to rely on the computer a little bit here to guide me through this. First Nations, Native Americans, Indigenous, or American Indians start with, are oriented to the land and the people. American Indian people structure music and ceremonies to fit their worlds and their differing views of the world in general. We, as Indians, address our music to gods, people, and the natural world. In an ideal world, music functions in all aspects of Native life, with all the inhabitants of a community sharing in, hold on, I have to find the next page. Okay. Sharing in ceremonies, rituals, social events, and lifeways, all connected to the original land. And that's going to be the theme of this whole panel. The land is the real world. It is the home, the sustainer, and the future. In the case of the Cherokees, we began in the hills and valleys of the southeastern United States. For hundreds of years, we farmed, fished, and hunted in Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, North and South Carolina, and Tennessee. In the United States and Canada, government policies have deliberately shrunk the Aboriginal lands to reservations and allotted lands. Thus, Native populations have been forcibly and occasionally voluntarily removed, relocated, and resettled far from home. People cause less trouble when they're far from home, they thought. First came the conquerors looking for treasure, slaves, and adventure. Next came the missionaries looking for souls to save or to condemn. Third, the educators appeared, looking for amiable pupils to indoctrinate and mold. And fourth, and most importantly, came settlers looking for land. You keep hearing that word. The Treaty of New Echota, signed in 1835 by a splinter group of Cherokee leaders in cooperation with Andrew Jackson, caused all the Cherokees to move, or 17,000 to move to Indian Territory over a period of 5 years. And in case of the Cherokees, 17,000 started out and about 13,000 got here. And some who got here were also ill or because of the journey, and there was a lot of rebuilding once they were on the new land. In my case, my mother's ancestors were on the trail. Before the removal, the Georgia militia and federal troops, federal troops working together forced Cherokee families from their homes into stockades, which you might call concentration camps. In Georgia alone, there was one militiaman for every 4 Cherokees, including children. There was no escape. There was no way to get past those people, who were all armed, of course. The Trail of Tears was an 850-mile journey. And in my case, my ancestors settled in what's now Sequoyah County. It was Skin Bayou District in those days. And many of my cousins still live there today. During the removal, Cherokee people sang at least 3 different hymns that we know of. One Drop of Blood, Amazing Grace, and I Will Not Live Always, to the tune of Home Sweet Home. And there's a story behind that. One of the prominent people who lived in the Cherokee Nation just before removal was a man named John Howard Payne. And he actually wrote the lyrics to Home Sweet Home. And that's his biggest claim to fame. And I looked at the Payne papers in the Newberry Library in Chicago a long time ago when I was a fellow there. And there's stories of how he would go out with one of the missionaries, Daniel Buttrick, to different homes and visit people. And in one home, somebody was actually singing Home Sweet Home, and he felt very excited about that. But then he found out they were actually singing it in Cherokee as a hymn. So things change, and people adapt to whatever's around them. I can't play you that example because I haven't been able to digitize it less. yet, but I will play you a very short excerpt first of One Drop of Blood. This is by the Cherokee Youth Choir. It's called One Drop of Blood. So this is a modern version. Can you hear it? Okay. I think I know how to stop it. Okay, there's several verses, so I'm not, this is a brand new computer. Let's put it that way. The other song, Amazing Grace, I'll play a little bit of that for you. And the words do not translate to Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Basically, it talks about Christ's second coming and Jesus, God's Son, and so forth. And this particular version is sung by Rita Coolidge, who is actually a Cherokee, with the Cherokee Children's Choir. Although the choir doesn't come in on this version, Rita sings it by herself. And again, I'll play only one verse. And it's from 2001, so it's not from the Trail of Tears. Okay, that's one verse. I do have recordings of those and the other one that I mentioned, the Home Sweet Home, but I haven't been able to digitize them yet, so I'll just have to enjoy them by myself for now. Okay. In the 1980s, the historian Fred Hoxie advanced the principle of prisons into homelands to explain the evolution of reservation life. His premise was that the tribal members who had been forced onto reservations had later become champions of their new native soil. Everything about the land changed when Indian Territory became Oklahoma in 1907. The 5 civilized tribes or nations, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, there they are. And you can take the 5 civilized nations with a grain of salt, as in terms of somebody forcing that identity on these 5 tribes. But they were also treated differently by the government than the other tribes in Oklahoma or Indian Territory at that time, who were deemed uncivilized. I was recently reading a new biography of Jim Thorpe, who's also from Oklahoma. And a lot of the he's found a lot of original material that I had not seen before in other biographies of Jim Thorpe. And one of the things that comes out is how beholden he was to the Indian agent here in Oklahoma. He didn't really have control of his own life. I mean, he had to keep going back to Carlisle. He had to keep asking for money to live on, even though his land he was supposed to get payments from his land and so forth. So there was a bit of a difference, I think, because, again, these 5 tribes call themselves nations and organize themselves into nations with their own schools, their own police, their own courts and education systems going up to post-secondary education. So the difference, I think, in that case was that they were treated differently and had a few more opportunities than the so-called uncivilized tribes. I'll skip quickly over the Dawes Act, 1887, where all the Indians had to get small parcels of land, a section, I think, for a father, a family, and sometimes smaller parcels for children. My grandfather and my great-grandfather got allotments, but my great-great-grandmother had died by then, and then in my case, my grandfather was the oldest of the children, but he didn't have any children till after statehood, 1908. So he only got the one section of land. Eventually, most of those allotments passed out of Indian control for different reasons. Also, black former slaves and their descendants settled in small all-black towns where they also tried farming. Now, to come to the present, and this is 2020, the Supreme Court in the McGirt decision ruled that the Creek or Muskogee Nation had retained the title to its reservation. In other words, the title had never been extinguished from treaties. By extension, the other 4 civilized tribes also retained their reservations adhering to the boundaries of the old nations. That's why we're sitting on Cherokee and Muskogee land. The 5 nations had taken advantage of this ruling in favor of sovereignty to establish larger court systems and to expand business enterprises throughout the eastern 35% of the state. And that sort of scares to death a few people in the state. And you can imagine there's some resistance to this. I'm almost finished. Concerning land acknowledgments, I think that there are so many layers of knowledge that influence those acts that we cannot be certain all the time of what we were saying. In an October 10th article in the PBS NewsHour, the authors invoke the Association of Indigenous Anthropologists. Does anybody know people in that group? Okay. They requested that the American Anthropological Association officially pause land acknowledgments and the related practice of the welcoming ritual in which Indigenous persons open conferences with prayers or blessings. They said, quote, "The pause will enable a task force to recommend improvements after examining these practices and the history of the field's relationship with American Indians and Alaska Natives more broadly." They're talking strictly there to anthropologists, but I think by extension some of us could relate to that. The article covers many other topics related to land: a mythic past, no land back, the trauma of lost land, alienation of people from land necessary for cultural practices, etc. Here we go again. On a high note, in California, the Tongva people on October 5th this year received an important gift of land back at the gateway to Eaton Canyon, a sacred site in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. Sharon Alexander Dreyfus gave her Altadena home and acreage to the Tongva Taraksat Paksava Conservancy, the nonprofit set up by the community to receive the land. With this new land ownership, The community can carry out sacred practices, here we go, using plants, trees, and acorns necessary for ceremonies. And evidently the owner, Sharon Dreyfus, had used the home as a rental. It's in Altadena, just north of Pasadena, and had let the acreage kind of grow wild. So the oak trees are huge and are a canopy over the whole place. And the plants are thriving because nobody's weeded the place in, 20 years or so. And the Tongva are just thrilled to pieces that all of that is there. So now they can use plants, trees, and acorns necessary for their ceremonies. It is a start. What up?
Joe Kay?
Good morning. My name is Joe Kay Dowell. I was born and raised in Claremore, Oklahoma. I graduated in 1974. And during my time in high school, I came to know there were several movements going on, social justice movements, anti-war movements, so I kind of grew up in that time. Let me go back a little. I guess I'm what a lot of Oklahomans like to think they are, a person, kind of a little bit of everything that is Oklahoman. I come from Cherokee people who were forced out of their southeastern homelands into Oklahoma. I also descend from the Quapaw people who our traditional homelands are more into Arkansas, but we hunted into this area and camped and stayed too with the Caddo people. But also, and probably my most favorite person ever on the planet in my life was my great grandmother. Her name was Myrtle Catherine Dowell, and she was a Sooner. She was one of the people who, as my other ancestors were being forced and marched and put in concentration camps in Oklahoma, her family were some of the white settlers who came, this family, from Tennessee, and hid and snuck into Oklahoma before each land run. So I spent a lot of time with my grandmother as well as my other native relatives, but I spent a lot of time with her. She lived down the street from us in Claremore. So I heard a lot of her family values and their history. She referred to Will Rogers as Cousin Will and would talk about horse-drawn carriages and going back and forth to Oologah. My grandfather, Wayman Dowell, was a bootlegger in Claremore, even when I was growing up. So we kind of have your typical settler. My grandmother was a Christian, but I also spent a lot of time with my Quapaw relatives up in the northeast corner of Oklahoma. And I kind of got a mix of some Christian values, but always combined with more traditional values. And I remember a lot of sitting around, with my great aunt, and listening to that family history, which is from our tree in the Quapaw people. My ancestor is Solomon Quapaw, and his two daughters married two brothers who came from what I was told my whole life growing up came from Ireland. As my daughter and I did research in the last few years, we found out the name McKibben, they're actually Scottish. And I've learned in research too that you don't say Scottish. That's kind of like, you're not really, you're kind of, it's Scots. But anyway, that history, I'm still learning about. I'm very interested in cultures, and that's kind of my take on this whole thing. You know, and now I do have my opinions. I know where I stand on certain issues. I hear a lot of people having a lot of concern about this term land back, but I don't think there's anything to fear there. And the ironic thing is that those people who do have that fear, you know, there's something a little deeper in me that is kind of glad that those who fear it can understand that feeling coming from people who have suffered that. And I think we were talking earlier about another land issue, immigration. And I had looked back through some work I had done in the early 2000s on that issue. And one of the things I had written for a published essay was that the irony of that. And, you know, I would encourage non-Indigenous people to try to examine where those fears of immigrants, especially the so-called illegal immigrants, you know, who gives anyone the right to assume that any human being is illegitimate or illegal, especially the people who were on this continent for millennia before there ever was a border. So, you know, there are a lot of things to consider here. It's like peeling an onion. There's just more and more and more. I'm still learning, and I've been doing social justice work in Native communities for 35 years. The other thing too, I'm glad that Charlotte gave that background on, you know, some of the legal history of Oklahoma. The thing I would like people to understand is that I work for the Indigenous Environmental Network, and I've been associated with them for 30 years. We advocate and teach traditional Native communities how to advocate for themselves. And IEN is an NGO, they have non-governmental organization status at the United Nations. So one thing to understand is that these laws that have been applied to Native peoples here in this state are something that's relatively new in regard to history. It's a global phenomenon, you know, the land issues and so-called resources that have been commodified over the centuries, and that the things that you see happening here with Native peoples in Oklahoma are happening globally. And I remember 30 years ago working with different communities here in Tulsa. When we first started using the term indigenous, we had Indian people here in Oklahoma who would say, "I'm not indigenous. I'm just an Indian. I'm just an Oklahoma Indian." So now, you know, it's a term that is widely used. People I think we live at a really crucial time in history. And although I will and have many times stood toe-to-toe with law enforcement and National Guard and the military, As far as land issues and boundaries and laws on Indian land and our right to govern and maintain our own lands, lifeways, resources, waters, air. There's a much bigger picture here that I advocate for everyone to see. We're at a crucial time in history where I think a lot of changes, drastic changes, need to come fairly soon if it's not too late, because we're at a tipping point where it's going to be, as far as the environment is concerned, if it's not already, and some scientists say it might be too late already, where we lose control of what we have caused. It's like a snowball rolling downhill, and we can't control it. I thank each one of you for being here and giving us the opportunity to have this discussion. Thank you.
Vicki?
I'm Vicki Monks, and I've been a journalist for a long time. It's hard to know where to start with this issue because there's so much that is not taught in schools. And I grew up in Tahlequah. I'm Chickasaw, but I grew up with Cherokees, and never heard much of anything. We got a little bit about the Trail of Tears, and then that was essentially it. Nothing about what had happened with allotment and loss of land after statehood. So is anyone here familiar with this book? It's Angie DeBose and Still the Waters Run. It's an incredible book, and when she was writing this, it was supposed to have been published by OU Press, but they wouldn't publish it because she names names. It's about, she calls what happened in Oklahoma an orgy of greed and plunder unmatched in American history. And in a little bit, we're going to show you a video that I put together with some friends about that sort of revolves around this book and what happened after allotment. But I came back to Oklahoma so I could reconnect with Chickasaws and figure out what happened with my own family. My grandmother was full Chickasaw, but never shared any stories about what had happened with her family. Her father had refused to let her speak Chickasaw. And I knew that my great-great-grandmother was named Alaki, but that is all. It's most likely she came on the trail. The name means she got here in Chickasaw, so that it's related to that. But this video and my book are called Lost in Oklahoma. It's about loss of land, loss of stories, loss of culture, and loss of connections. And it's been, before I get into that very much, I want to say it has been so gratifying in recent years that because of the gaming industry, tribes for the first time have capital that they can invest and develop businesses and provide jobs and buy back land. Chickasaws have been buying back thousands of acres. Cherokees have too. It's going on across the country. And there are people who frown on gambling, but I kind of like it that our casino down on the Red River is almost entirely frequented by Texans, mostly from Dallas. And I just love it that those Texans are coming up here giving us all their money. It's so things are starting to turn, but and this isn't land, but it is, I mean, the tribes are the economic drivers in Oklahoma now. And, you know, investing in business from precision aerospace parts to exoskeletons to help paralyzed people move, and, you know, really sophisticated. And, you know, some things like telemarketing and that sort of thing. But it's just because so much land was lost. What people had to scatter. My grandmother had an allotment over by Quinton, and they lost it during the Dust Bowl. They couldn't make a living on the land anymore, and the banks were just snapping up, you know, they were snapping up all the land they could get. So we had no land. Grandma lost it all, and my mother's family, my grandma, grandpa, my mom and all her siblings, my aunts and uncles, were migrant farm workers in California. They rode out on the trains to California and they picked grapes. They lived in a tent at the edge of the field. My mom hated trains her whole life because she was so cold on that train. And the train tracks were right there by their tents, and every night the trains would barrel through. It was the culmination of not just the loss of the homelands in the East, which is what most people think of when they think of land, Indian land that was lost. But once they got to Oklahoma, these territories were all supposed to remain as tribal territories, and they did not. And you'll see in this video, this is from a brochure that says Uncle Sam opens the way to more than 8 million acres of land once belonging to these tribes. And now it's free for everybody to come in and take it. And when you talk about the Woody Guthrie song, "This land is your land, this land is my land," it was supposed to be Indian land, and the Allotment Act was supposed to allow Native people to keep small bits that they should be able to farm. And it was like, you know, turning everybody into farmers regardless of what their talents were. And because of the circumstances, so many people could not make it. And then came the graft. The politically well-connected people, I mean, at one time, many of you may know this, but Muskogee, Oklahoma, had more lawyers per capita than New York City, because there was such an industry of figuring out how to defraud Indian people and take their land. When oil was discovered in Seminole country, people would just file fraudulent deeds, and the Seminole people, who often didn't speak English, who had no money to challenge anything in court, just lost their land. Or adverse possession, where someone would have an allotment, 100 miles away, not even know it. If a squatter came in and said, "I'm gonna live here for 15 years, then after 15 years, that land became the squatter's legal land. And the native person, the indigenous person, lost that land So what I would like to do is educate more people about what happened then, not just in old times, because it's easy if you think of it as happening hundreds of years ago. It's easy to say, well, that's ancient history. We don't have to worry about that. If you realize it was happening in the lifetimes of our parents, our own lifetimes, then it becomes more relevant. And it's happening worldwide, as J.K. said, right now. I covered a story in Indonesia about indigenous people who lived along the coastlines of the big island that's part of Papua New Guinea. It's the other half of the island, and they live in tree houses, and their primary source of food is the sago palm tree. It's an extremely nutritious source of carbohydrates. And when I visited people there, no one owns parcels of land. But if you point to any sago tree, anyone can tell you which family has rights to that tree, which family, once it's mature, will be able to cut down that tree and then have that nutrition. But a multinational corporation was coming in with a ship, a factory ship, and they were chopping down the sago palms. So without regard to this, who knows how many hundreds of years or millennia this had been going on, that people had been living this way and depending on this resource, and just taking the resource to make plywood glue. So I think if you look around with what happens with indigenous people worldwide, there's stories like this everywhere. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Vicki. I think that provides us with an opportunity to perhaps briefly turn our discussion. There's a lot of coverage. I think we're all aware. Northern Plains, some of the issues with extractive technologies, mining in particular, but I think it might be worthwhile for us to talk a little bit about what are some of the major environmental and issues of environmentalism and environmental justice here in Oklahoma, because again, I think that there are important forces that keep those stories from broad and general circulation. So, okay, you want to start us off?
Okay, sure. I would just like to follow up on a point that Vicki was making about the ways in which land was taken from Native people, and there were many. Y'all might know that there's a movie about to come out. I thought it was already supposed to be out, but Killers of the Flower Moon, about how in the Osage Nation, how headrights and people were declared incompetent, crazy, all the way to being murdered, jailed, whatever it took. But still in Cherokee County right today, I can probably pick up the Tahlequah Daily Press and show you at least one, and several throughout the week, quiet titling of Indian lands. So when you see these ads in the paper, it will name heirs, and a lot of times you can tell by the names that it's Indian land that they're quiet titling. There was a man in Cherokee County who owned an oil company, a small oil company. He owned a nursing home there, an awful, ill-reputable nursing home. His name was Veerman Davis. He was quite famous, infamous for quiet titling Indian lands. And when he couldn't quiet title it, he and his henchmen and relatives would just go out and camp on the land like you were talking about. I had some friends who were not your typical Cherokee people. who stood up to him, and there was quite a bit of trouble over that. So this still goes on. We're still dealing with some of the same mentalities. Here in Oklahoma, so, and that's, if you watch, I know that because I live in Cherokee County. I'm sure that still happens throughout the state, or anywhere where it's possible to quiet title land in the country. Here in Oklahoma, some of the issues that we're dealing with, and they're intergenerational. Up where my people are, the Quapaw, we're dealing with a history of lead and zinc mining. And if you drive through the country up there, you will see these huge mounds of gravel, for lack of a better word. It's chat. It's tailings from mining, where they just, it looks like maybe giants went in there and just literally dug in the ground and piled it. So there's, leaching into the water tables. There's the chat is poisonous. And so there were a lot of families up there who lived on those lands, and if they wanted a road into their, and this was not just Indian people, at one point it was possible where people just went into these areas and loaded up their pickup beds with this mine tailings and, would lay a driveway. Kids played on those piles of tailings. So that's Tar Creek. Actually, that was the first Superfund site years ago, back in the 80s, I believe. Let's see, Cherokee country. There's there used to be a lot of mining for, well, it was the same kind of my mind just went blank there. But there's still mine tailings down there around Sequoyah County. Mm-hmm. The Poncas are dealing with, of course, has anyone ever been up to Ponca City? When you drive into Ponca City, especially from the south, it's and at night, if you drive in, you see all these lights, and for a moment you might think you're driving into a big city. But in the daytime, there's this stark reality of all this industry, oil, liquefied natural gas. I did a story once about their landfill, and when our friend Casey Camp tells a story about how the Ponca, when they first went there, they were choosing a place for their to bury their people who had died on the trail, and they had chosen this spot because, and it was on a hilltop, because they could see all directions around. That was important to them. Well, here comes the city years later, and now when you stand in their cemetery, you see this huge cell that contains the landfill. Through Osage Nation, there's oil tanks that leak. Down in Kiowa country, same thing. You've got the Keystone pipeline that runs. This is nothing new. You may have heard protests over the KXL, the extension of the Keystone pipeline, but it's already run through there for years. I go down to my relatives in Sac and Fox country, and we go out to some family land of my sister-in-law's, and the pipeline runs right through their property. So it's everywhere, and if you look at a map of the country, I believe it's the USGS, you can do a search on pipelines that run through Oklahoma, and I know at one point we had printed it with some red ink and it just looks like blood. The Capitol, I remember several years ago, President Obama came through to Cushing, and there was a big PR push for the pipelines, and they called it the pipeline capital of the world. The thing about it was when you got to do some digging, all the promises they made about these new pipelines were nothing but lies. They were temporary jobs. You had we say we don't have man camps in Oklahoma, but anytime you drive through Cushing, what few hotels there are full of, oil construction. The fracking caused, I know some relatives of mine, their houses are just about to fall now where the foundation is cracked and then hence the frame of the home. Also, after I got to digging at one point, I found out that Cushing had the highest gas prices in the state during that time that they were selling these pipelines to people. So, I guess one point I would make is that I would encourage everyone to understand, they had to take the land from us first. And if you dig on certain issues, we had talked about this morning, there are much bigger entities like foreign countries out there who are buying up land. And I think it's something that instead of, they like to pit us all against one another, but there's some bigger dangers out here that have been caused by greed, by industry, multinational corporations, and it's not just here in Oklahoma that I think we need to look past these fights, that where we're pitted against one another at those pictures and try to see what's coming. I wish humanity was a little more capable of doing that. Are there any others?
Well, you mentioned Ponca City, and one of the stories that I worked on was about carbon black
Yes.
plant. Carbon black is an ultrafine particulate, and it's what they put into tires, and it's a conditioner for the tires. The higher quality of the carbon black, the better the tires.
It's what makes them black.
It's what makes them black. But this plant had been spewing out contamination for decades. Ponca people who got their allotments close to that plant, Thurman and Thelma Buffalo Head told me that all of their white chickens were just coated with a greasy black particulates that they would wake up with.
Actually, there was that little Indian housing addition.
That's what I was going to say.
Right next to that plant.
Well, they wanted to, Thurman and Thelma got away from there. And the people who had allotments that surrounded that plant went to the BIA and said, you have got to get us out of here. It's too contaminated to live. And I got memos from the BIA with them saying, this land, we can't sell this land. It's too contaminated to sell. So what did they decide to do? They built Indian housing for families.
In the shadow of that facility.
Right next door. So the bulk of the contamination was coming down on all of those people with young children, and whatever damage that kind of pollution does to the lungs of an adult, it's exponentially greater the younger the child to be exposed to that. There were, white farmers down the road actually who had, their prized white-faced sheep, they're prized for their white wool, and these sheep were just coated. You'd never know.
And nothing really ever happened on that issue. The Ponca people complained for years, but nothing really ever happened on that issue until those ranchers and farmers, and if I'm not mistaken, some of the workers inside the plant organized, and they all joined forces, and I believe they won a lawsuit. But if you went to Thailand, where the parent company of this facility was, I was told you could have done the white glove test there. But these little Ponca children were going out to play, and after a couple of hours would come in just covered with soot. I was there, and we were there several times, I'm sure, with them. I know we did a walk, and we're on that property at one point. I had on a brand new pair of cowboy boots, and they were ruined after spending 2 hours in that community. It was just, I mean, to try to explain it, it was just... yeah.
For the health and safety of people is, it of course affects everybody in the community, but the blatant disregard that was shown by the BIA, that was shown by these corporations, because, these are indigenous people. They have no power. And
or they're drunks, or they're dirty anyway, or they just don't care, but live in the shadow of something like that and deal with it every day, and see if you're going to go out and plant your flowers and mow your lawns.
And then there's Sequoia Fuels with
Yes.
radioactive raffinate being applied in Sequoia County, applied to the, that plant.
Well, yeah, and what that was, so everybody knows the name Karen Silkwood. There was a Kerr McGee facility, and it still stands down there along the river there at Gore, Oklahoma, named for one of the Gore family. There was a uranium processing facility there. They processed raw yellow cake, and actually, they talk about how well they finally shut them down, but they got themselves shut down. They ignored workers, ignored the community for decades, and it just got to where they were so hapless that the EPA had to step in and shut them down. There was, I know we've interviewed people down there, and actually I worked down there on a project with out of Boston, Clark University and OSU on a project down there, trying to get community input and find out what was actually happening down there. That was in the 90s. And it was still hard to bring different people to the table, because there were people who wanted to work no matter what the facility did, how bad it was, and there were others who wanted it shut down. There actually had been drive-by shootings, and it got really bad down there, but finally they had to shut them down because it was just, there were continual releases, accidental releases that they didn't even notify the community about. And then aside from the piles of yellow cake laying around everywhere, at one point when I was down there, they were in the process of trying to decommission it, dig up what they could and transport it, I believe, I want to say Tennessee, somewhere in the southeast. Of course, it's been since the 90s, so I'm not sure what the status is right now. They were going to build with what they couldn't dig up. They were going to collapse the buildings, put everything into a containment cell with a 1,000-year fence. Now, who's going to be around in 1,000 years to see if that fence is still standing? We're so used to, and that's when a lot of these issues, like right now, you can travel throughout the Gulf Coast. We were in DC last year it was called People versus Fossil Fuels. We went to DC to try to demand that Biden come through on his campaign promises and declare a climate emergency so that legislation could be put in place and start to address these issues. And while we were down there, most of us were Native people because it was the week of Indigenous Peoples Day. On Monday, President Biden declared Indigenous Peoples Day, and 137 of us got arrested out in front of the White House. They arrested 655 of us during that whole week. But I want people to understand that what you see, like along the Gulf Coast, we met with some I was in awe of these people. John Beard, I believe is his name. He's an organizer. I believe he is in Port Arthur, Texas. And then there was another black woman. I can't remember her name, but she won the Goldman Environmental Prize 2 years ago. We met with, those are the people who were with us in DC. And to hear the stories, I lived in New Orleans, and then I lived in Mobile for a while. And so I saw even back then, the amount of environmental degradation, and then you count the destruction and the potential danger to the public that these hurricanes cause. So when these industries start, when they build, they usually go into poor people of color communities and into Indian lands. But when this degradation begins, when there's leachate in the water, when there's soot in the air, when there's these accidental releases, and this goes on all the time. Fracking, the number of earthquakes that have happened in Oklahoma since in the last decade, this is not just about us. And that's what everyone needs to understand. We all are being disregarded. And my hope is that at some point we can all wake up and join together and do something about it. I'm sorry, I attended you.
We're, I think, at a point where when we put this together, we really wanted to try to stimulate conversation. So I think this would be a good, appropriate time for us to perhaps turn to questions, if any of you, topics that we haven't touched on, drill down with more detail on something we have. Yes, please.
A question for Dr. Heth. I'm in Southern California, and I've been watching the whole Chumash, Gabrieleño, and Tongva issue. It seems sad to me, although it was happy news, that the Tongva depended on a private citizen donating land. Doesn't that seem...
It is tragic. The problem is that they are not a federally recognized tribe, so they don't have the kinds of advocacy that federally or even a California recognized tribe would have. So they're at a handicap to get back any of their land, and they formed this land trust just for this purpose. And I think it's probably going to happen. They had to pay $20,000 for all the fees, transfer fees, and all that kind of stuff to actually get the land. But what if it had been the $2.2 million that the land was appraised? They would have gotten it. Had to be a gift. And I think unless they get some kind of recognition, they're going to have trouble. The Chumash are doing better. Gabrieleño not so much, but the tribes who actually have reservations or land that they started out with are doing okay, like the Serrano, Covilla, and some of the tribes up north. Chumash are doing fine. But it's just a matter of hanging on to what you had. And unfortunately for the Tongva, they had Los Angeles. And nobody's given that back. Except that one nice lady.
Yes, sir.
Charlotte, I wondered, you spent time in Oklahoma, and then spent a lot of time away from Oklahoma, and then now have returned in retirement. And you mentioned the connection to the land, and I wondered if you could comment a little bit about your perception, having returned, having been away for a while, in terms of change of attitude and practice, religious practice and so forth, connected to the land. Do you see a change in the consciousness of young people today as opposed to perhaps when you were there as a younger person?
I think actually it's gotten better, and I think Vicki alluded to it in that some of the tribes now have money from casinos and so forth. Cherokee tribe, Chickasaw tribe, and our Choctaw tribe are investing it back into community activities and events. So there's a rise of activities like stickball games, different kinds of dances, ceremonies, and so forth, and recognition of artists in the tribes and so forth. I think it's probably better than it was when I was a kid in terms of that, but I don't know if people are as nice as they were when I was a kid. You know, I think some of the commercialization of everything has made it just a little bit more competitive and a little bit more. The word "not nice" doesn't cut it, but you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, something like that. Now, Jason could comment on that, I think, more than I could. You want to say anything about that?
I think it's a good question, and I think your answer is a really good one.
Oh, okay.
A piece that I would maybe take the prompt into a question, maybe for Joe K. Dow, and it builds on Vicki's point about the Cherokee, and you raised this also, Charlotte, the Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw Nation, and increasingly having resources to do work as sovereign nations. The concern that I have increasingly is just the tremendous inequality between the smallest federally recognized nations in Oklahoma and the largest, such that I'm very concerned, and particularly in this political environment, which is, Charlotte, to use your phrase, the political environment in Oklahoma right now is really not nice. And there's a long history of that, which we've heard about. But I'm increasingly concerned about those nations that don't have the kinds of resources the Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation enjoy, particularly when it comes to the environmental issues that are on the table today. The Wichita and affiliated tribes, or the Ponca, for instance. I mean, the differences of scale and economy are a concern, and I'd be interested, particularly in your comparative experience working with grassroots groups on environmental issues, how the differences are playing out, say, between Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation and the smaller nations.
No, you're exactly right. And one concern and I come from a small tribe. We have 6,000 members, the Quapaw. I'm also a member of the Cherokee Nation. I'm dually enrolled. I'm also Eastern Shawnee and Peoria. So there are, the Cherokee Nation, what do they have? 400,000 members, something like that. The thing about, I know especially about probably 3 or 4 decades ago when they first started compacting with the state, it really put the smaller tribes at a disadvantage, because once, there's precedent, once the state can get something out of one, they want to apply it to everyone. People might be aghast, but there are 100, I think at last I knew there were 100 casinos in Oklahoma. Not all the status of the Hard Rock or, the bigger ones from the bigger tribes, but they do quite well still, even the smaller ones. I'm not a big fan of gambling. I don't gamble. I enjoy the entertainment that it brings, especially the musicians that it brings to the state. And I hope at some point, you know, we can develop more sustainable, instead of falling into weapons contracts and intelligence and all of that surveillance kind of technology. There's a push now, especially from the younger people, for the tribes to start thinking Indian, and that's where you see a lot of this coming back, like Charlotte was talking about. Because you don't see the traditional people out in front, they're there, they've always been there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the knowledge for the fat, and well, I am who I am.
Just say it.
The fat, you know, otherwise the fat cats in the big offices and the big chairs in the casinos wouldn't have the ammunition or the knowledge to do what they do and get that done in the kind of negotiations where, you know, where the state gets upset is when the fat cats won't play with them. But now, you know, and this is nothing new. Since the 70s with the American Indian movement, you know, there was this, and really that wasn't even new, because back in the 20s, a man from the Haudenosaunees went to what was then the League of Nations. So this push, a lot of people think that, you know, the Indian Wars ended in 1890 at Wounded Knee. Well, they didn't. So there's still been this push. I think it's, our creation stories tell us that Creator put us here. And, you know, there have been a lot of theories put forth to disprove that and to disconnect us from our original connection to this land. But there are still communities, traditional people in most of our communities. They may just be a handful of people, but they're still there. And they'll do what they have always done when it gets really contentious. They'll go underground. They'll protect that very essence of who we are. You can Christianize everybody as many as you want and think you have, but there are people like me who are more vocal. But even I have relatives who, for instance, I can put a picture and a recipe for my sausage gravy and biscuits on Facebook, and I'll get 500 likes, comments for days. I can put something up about McGirt and the consequences of all this extractive industries, and it's like crickets on there. But even those quieter ones, once you talk with them, it's like Joey Harjo said, you know, she has a poem called She Had Some Horses, and it talks about how those people, we've been here forever. And there's something, when I was a kid, my family traveled all across the state. I grew up on the powwow circuit. So we were back and forth across the state. And I don't know, I can remember as a really young girl, I mean, 8 or 10 years old, you know, this much land, and other people had this much land, and most of us had none. So I don't really understand where that comes from, except for one of my role models and mentors, Francis Wise, always said, we have a collective cell memory that's within us that was put there by the Creator. And you may not find me in all of the ceremonies, but I'll be out there in front protecting. That's my job, protect those traditional communities who will still care for this earth and maintain that knowledge.
I have a question. Hi, my name's Emmy. I work at First Peoples Fund and also with the National Folklife Network. And so one thing I think about a lot in my work, one part of which is developing a national Native arts curriculum. In talking to people and then being here for AFS, I've been thinking a lot about that idea of land acknowledgements, but then without any action connected to it, which is why I came here today to hear you all speak. And then thinking about that within the field of folklore, where there is a lot of extractive processes that goes on within our communities as Native people, where we all know and understand how all of these different pieces are connected. Everything that impacts us is connected to all of these other things. And when we're looking at that in terms of these extractive pieces of extractive processes within folklore, within our Native communities here in the United States, I'm wondering like how, if there are specific ideas and thoughts you all have around how we build that understanding of connection to how that cultural piece connects to our land bases. And I'm privileged enough to be in my homelands where our people have lived forever, where we emerged from onto this earth, which I really had to think about a lot in coming here to Oklahoma and how those different histories have impacted our different peoples. But I'm wondering like how, in relating that to the field of folklore and relating that to those statements of land acknowledgements, I don't know where I'm going with this question. I think I've already asked my question. I just want to kind of get your thoughts on that.
I'll be happy to give you that article that I quoted about land acknowledgement, because there's all of these ideas are covered in those 4 pages of that little paper, and it talks about past traumas and also about reminding people of what they've lost. Just if I'm standing here, I lost Georgia or Tennessee, that kind of thing. But so far we haven't lost Oklahoma. But, I'll give you. I have it electronically. I can just send it to you after the meeting, okay? And I think you'll get a lot of your questions answered on that. Yeah.
And where are you from? Who are your people?
I'm Suchahu and Oglala Lakota, but I'm a citizen of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. I live in Pine Ridge now. I grew up in Rosebud, but live in Pine Ridge now.
Welcome to Oklahoma.
When I first heard, I was in California probably 30 years ago when 7 Generation Fund first started talking about land acknowledgements. And I wasn't sure how I felt about that. But over the years, I've come to understand that the danger and why a lot of people don't like to hear, especially non-Native people, start acknowledging the land and the people from where it came. There's a danger in that, because you start remembering, you acknowledge the original people, and that brings us closer together. The powers that be, who out of greed can't seem, and that is the idea of capitalism now. I remember when I grew up, there was such thing as, I've made enough money. That's gone. I met some young people from everywhere at that direct action training that Casey had. And these young people just started sending me all these kinds of files. And I learned that even as this country was being founded, there were British economists teaching this kind of capitalism, where you just bleed people dry. You put out, we think this is something new, you know, put out a bottle of water like you were talking about for $9. There's somebody out there that's going to buy it. And when he does, there's a few more coming behind him just because. We see that happening today. So for me, at the core of this is just pure greed. And it's you know, it's something that we all have to align with. But that's the danger in when you see people reacting negatively to the land back. And what Charlotte was talking about with the Tongva people, that's nothing new either. My daughter's people are the Meskwaki, they're Sac Fox from Iowa. They were forced into Oklahoma. There were the Sox and the Foxes, and the government put them together and forced them into Oklahoma down around Stroud and Cushing and in that area. Some of them went back, but they saved up money. They worked and sold whatever they had and went back and purchased their land near what's called Tama, Iowa now. It's not a reservation but it's their land. It's called the Meskwaki Indian Settlement. There were a rancher, farmer, landowner in Iowa, and this is probably 30 years ago. I want to say they gave them, I don't remember how much land, but they gave them, this private landowner gave them their land back. So this is something that's been going on. There's also been the Indian Land Tenure Act, where, say my family's allotment up in Ottawa County, this is probably 30 years ago when I first heard of it. It rocked along and people were working on this issue and fighting with Congress over it. But it ended up to where, I mean, my family, my siblings, there were 4 of us, we had enough land inherited that we could stick our foot in. That was about it. So what they did was the tribes started finding those heirs with that little bit of land and either asking them to give it back or to sell it back to the tribes. So that's one way, that's another way they're getting their land back.
There's a case in Oregon. I think most people know about Chief Joseph and how he was forced out of his homeland, Nez Perce homeland, and was, having battles, many of which they won with the cavalry, trying to get to Sitting Bull in Canada. Didn't make it, but 120 years, I think, after Chief Joseph was forced off of that Nez Perce land, there was a huge swath, and this has been 25 years ago, so I don't quite remember the number of acres, but 10, 20,000 acres or more in the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. And that came about, this nonprofit organization called Trust for Public Land. They buy up land that is sensitive or threatened. If it comes up for sale, someone has a huge ranch and they know this is either culturally, environmentally valuable, then they go in and purchase it and then convey that to the people who can take care of it. And that's what they did with this Wallowa Valley land. The Nez Perce had tried for 100 years to get land back in that valley because that's where their ancestors were buried. And there was such extreme racism that they were not, no one would even sell land to any Nez Perce citizen. So with the Trust for Public Land doing this quietly, then they came back. There were still some racist blowback but they do have that land now, and it's just amazing to see. One of the pieces of sound that I interviewed Horace Axtell, who was the spiritual leader of the Nez Perce, and he's sitting there quietly at the top of this draw, and he says, "You hear that? You hear that wind? That's our ancestors saying, 'We're glad you are here.'" And that gives me chills even now.
Well, and if anyone understands the destruction that non-native plants can cause with any, temperate zone or any piece of land, we just want to be back. There have been studies done that shows we have the highest rates of diabetes in the world. Study after study has shown we can cure that by eating our traditional foods that come from where we come from. So, I mean, that's another reason for land back. It's not just greed and, hey, we want this back just because. There are reasons for that. Food is one. Our medicines are another. We're learning that modern medicine is not the thing they thought it was. So on and on. Nixon gave back Blue Lake to the Taos people back in the 60s. So, this is something new that people, I think because they're seeing us more on Yellowstone and Rutherford Falls and
a reservation.
We're trendy again, so people are starting to go, hey, what's up with, so, but these things that are been going on.
One more. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned food, and there's a couple of things that I know a little bit about here in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma City, where I am, there are some efforts to create reclaiming the soil and to create and to share that. One program that I know of had is outreach to urban Native youth, and they have been learning how to create compost and how to grow food and share that food with the community. And I know there's also, I don't have any personal connections to it at this point, but the food sovereignty efforts that are both in the Black communities and in the Native communities. And so that's just a little bit of the other side of it. That is growing nationally a little bit. It's much smaller, but I think that's potential for us all to
Oh yeah, it's great. I've been seeing where, they've been buying back like parking garages and growing food in those. There's in Oregon, there's somewhere up there, my geography. It's Wyoming, one of those states up in there. There's a coalition of people who built like a 7-story building, and they're growing food in there. If you look around in our own communities, there's lots of these same things going on everywhere. We just have to reconnect and not be pitted against one another.
Right.
Well, I want to, we're nearing the end. I know our colleagues from AFS have other obligations. There's other events. There's some wonderful programming this afternoon up at the Cain's Ballroom, if you're interested. But I want to thank the American Song Archives, Woody Guthrie Center, and Bob Dylan Center. Thank the various components of the American Folklore Society for helping us to make this possible. And I want to extend our appreciation to all of you for your patience and your participation this morning. And with that, Vicki was kind enough to bring a short film, about a 10-minute film, that we're going to show here in the auditorium afterwards. You're more than welcome to stay. I encourage you to take advantage of the free admission and to visit the Woody Guthrie Center. There's a great display on the This Land song and a lot of background documentary material available to you. So please avail yourselves to that, and thanks again for sharing your morning with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Uncle Sam opens the way to Indian lands. By act of Congress, restrictions will be removed on July 27, 1908 for more than 8 million acres of land now belonging to the Cherokee Creek Seminole Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians in the new state of Oklahoma. For particulars, see page 49 and 50 of this book.
Well, the Indians don't need all that land. They aren't even using it. Thanks, Uncle Sam.
You've got to understand that we have legal title to this land. We had a deal with the federal government. It wasn't the best deal for us, but we didn't have a whole lot of choice. We traded our homelands for land here, and it was supposed to be forever.
Ponca City was celebrating the land run with their centennial, and we were protesting the name of a statue that they were dedicating called "This Land is My Land." Mostly what the statue meant was it taking over our land and giving it away to settlers who hadn't earned any part of it. They just ran in and took it. At the protest or the dedication of the statue, the Indians were forced to stay on a barricade. They had it roped off, and a line of policemen was holding back a crowd of Indians. And sitting across on the other side was the settlers dressed in their little bonnets and cotton dresses.
Listen to this. Tribal leaders are raining on Oklahoma's 100th birthday parade. Imagine that. The Daily Oklahoma says some Native Americans are refusing to celebrate because they associate statehood with land runs and other aspects of white settlement. The editorial says it's hard to portray this attitude as anything but petty party pooking. I think the problem is most people don't know what happened here 100 years ago. And not just the land runs, but the graft, the corruption, and the outright theft of Indian lands after statehood. Newspapers trying to tell us it's all ancient history, and that we should just forget it and get on with the program. And that'd be okay, except this theft of our lands back then is still making a big difference in our lives today.
It is important for everyone to know of that history, but it's one of those kind of ugly tales of the past. They don't want it to be told because it creates a cloud of doubt on the sanctity of the founding of the state of Oklahoma.
Under the policy of turning all reservations into homesteads, minimal amount owned by tribes, and the declaration that once the allotments were made to all tribal members, the other land was declared surplus. That was sold off to non-Indians.
When you mention allotment, Most people will say that's when the government gave land to the Indians, but that wasn't true. The land was already ours. We had legal title. Allotment just let Indian families keep small parcels. But the way they set up the system, they made sure that a lot of us couldn't even hold on to those small bits.
But often where a family lived and where it got its land were two different locations. And there's a doctrine in the law called adverse possession, which means if somebody occupies land under open and notorious possession for 15 years, at least that's the number of years in Oklahoma, they can then claim ownership of the land. Congress passed a law in probably around the middle of the 19s, which allowed those same doctrines to apply to the lands of the 5 civilized tribes. So some of those tribal members lost lands because of this adverse possession issue.
My grandma lost her allotment of land, and I don't think she even knew she had it. She didn't even know where Duncan, Oklahoma, or the county in western Oklahoma. I don't think she even knew she had land there. But I did a research on it, and it was somehow her land was lost. And I talked to BIA officials, and they said after 15 years, anyone can claim the land. And as we had a lot of that squatters, I guess you call them. A lot of Indians didn't know that land there, or that they would go to the store and buy something to build their house, materials or something. Like my grandfather, he lost his land because they said he owed a bill for lumber, and he lost that land allotment.
Sometimes guardians were appointed for lands. The Indians declared to be incompetent, and a white guardian would sign over the land, sometimes selling it to friends or neighbors and so forth. So that kind of grafted corruption. The idea that, well, these Indians aren't really using it as farmers as was intended, so they ought to sell it off to white farmers who can really use it. Those kinds of concepts and attitudes took place. So there's a heavy degree of racism in that outlook on Indian land.
The respected historian, the late Angela Bow, documented what happened here after statehood. And still the waters run. It's one of the best histories ever written about Oklahoma. And she writes, the general effect of allotment was an orgy of plunder and exploitation, probably unparalleled in American history. And she names names. The records are still there. Some of Oklahoma's most prominent politicians and business leaders of the day were involved in cheating Indians out of land and mineral rights. They're the ones who got rich, they're the ones who built this state. After oil was discovered in Seminole territory, hundreds of Seminoles lost their allotments because of fraudulent deeds. But they were too poor to challenge the forgeries in court. So, once again, they lost their land and the oil. Another scam, white guardians appointed to represent supposedly mentally defective Indians. DeBow writes, it began to be apparent that all Indians who owned oil property were mentally defective and required legal guardians, white guardians, who then kept most of the oil money for themselves. And loss of our resources didn't stop with the oil boom.
When the OGE plant around Red Rock, Oklahoma, where the Otos are living now in contemporary times, when it was being built, land was bought up, in some cases probably taken for that facility, and land that we know as our homeland is underwater. So I've never seen it. Likewise, in Pawnee, where my family comes from also, the lake was a man-made lake, and many of the Pawnee's lands were taken for that lake. So I've never seen that either. Well, that is the source of my sadness about the land and coming out of the proudness of our name, but still having the contemporary puzzle of what that would be like and what it would be like today if we could see it and be on it and care for it.
The University of Tulsa just did a small survey of college students, and they found that there's more harsh racist feelings toward Native Americans than any other ethnic or minority group. These are educated kids, and they seem to think all of us Indians are rich, that we're getting some kind of special treatment, extra benefits, and they resent us for that.
When I was director of the Oklahoma City Indian Clinic and the Dallas Intertribal Center, I used to get phone calls all the time. People calling and saying that they just got their Indian card and what were they eligible for. They wanted to know where to sign up for their free house and their free food and where did they send their medical bills. And I would have to explain to them that, first of all, they need to know, they need to move to wherever their tribe was. If they were Choctaw, they needed to move to Durant or Tishomingo or wherever, and they would have a waiting list for maybe 5 years or more, and then maybe they would get a house, and they were just shocked that they just thought Indian people got everything for free. All you had to be was Indian to get it, And I've heard some funny stories about how others would say, when they would say, well, what do I get for being Indian? I said, well, you might get fired, or the police would pick you up first or just take you in without, any other things. So, they have such strange ideas about what it means to be Indian because they think we get everything for free.
And it's related to the fact that they fundamentally don't understand Indian history or national history. U.S. history is a loss to them. They have no concept of the idea that the U.S. wanted to buy land from the Indians. To do so, it had to pay them monies, and it pays in goods and services. It turns out functionally to be more like rent. The U.S. government is still owing some of those services and payments and protections. The U.S. pledges itself to us, the U.S. government pledges itself, the U.S. presidents, the Senate, the Congress, they've all, representatives of these people who are resenting Indians, have all been involved in the process of developing this relationship because it was a cooperative relationship.
Oklahoma's Republican Senator Tom Coburn called the treaties a joke. He says, and I quote, "It's one thing for us to keep our obligations to recognize Native Americans, but it's a totally different thing for us to allow a primitive agreement to undermine Oklahoma's future. The thing is, our tribes are Oklahoma's future."
And besides that, tribes are, and their casinos and related activities are some of the only economic development taking place in rural Oklahoma. And it employs non-Indians as well as Indians. Plus, because ancillary services are generated, the clothing bought, the food bought, the gas bought, it provides revenue sources and revenue possibilities and economic development possibilities for other people in the community. And in addition to that, tribes as good neighbors are pledging and providing funding for things like police cars, police radios, fire trucks, emergency services, bridges, roads. They're doing their part.